So in this video, let's talk about 3 superpowers that will make all the difference to your presentations. They will turn good presentations into great presentations, and they will help you to truly engage with your audience. So let's jump straight into it. And my first superpower is mindset. Now, when we talk about mindset, let's first of all talk about jokes. Now, whenever I'm working in training, be that in a university or in a company, and I ask people to brainstorm techniques that they know for presentations, one of the first ones that somebody in the group will mention is telling jokes. Now, there are so many other techniques that we can use that I would really avoid telling jokes. Jokes for me are a big no-no. And there are so many disadvantages that I would simply do something else. First of all, a joke can backfire. There's nothing worse if you're presenting and you're in the beginning stage of your presentation and then you tell a joke and nobody laughs. In fact, people look a little bit confused. And then as a presenter, you just feel dreadful. And that feeling will go on all the way through the presentation, and it's really difficult to recover from that. There are other problems with jokes as well. Jokes can be really bound to a culture, a corporate culture or a country culture. And a joke that is funny to one group of people can be really unfunny or have no meaning to another group of people. Let me give an example. I'm British, and the British have a particular sense of humour. And a joke that can be told by me to other British people in a British group of people might have meaning and it might be funny, but as soon as I go into an international audience, that joke might not be funny for other people. Jokes as well, you really have to think about other politically sensitive issues such as race and gender. And all in all, jokes are such a minefield and there are so many disadvantages that I just wouldn't tell jokes. Now, what is different is mindset and turning negative mindset into a positive mindset and really letting your personality come out in presentations. I know it's difficult to believe sometimes, but a presentation will not be the worst thing that happens to you in life. A presentation, it can appear serious, but in reality, in the long run of things, it's not a serious thing. And with practice and training, you can really begin to learn to love presentations and to enjoy doing them. And when you begin to enjoy doing them and you start having fun, then your personality will come out. And if you have a sense of humour, then let that come out in the presentation. Let your presentation have a lightness of touch that works in the presentation and is engaging with your audience and is endearing to your audience. As soon as you begin to smile, you will begin to relax. As soon as you begin to smile, other people will relate to you. As soon as you begin to smile, you will begin to get better at smiling. You'll learn to really smile and to engage people and to smile with your eyes. Now, this is all very easy to say, but everything is always to do with balance. And when you're presenting, there will always be a balance between seriousness and being flippant or too jokey or too sensitive, having too much of a sense of humour in the presentations. For example, if I'm working for a human rights organisation and I'm presenting about the breach of human rights in different countries, and I have some pretty horrific examples, this might be the wrong place to be using a sense of humour or maybe even a lightness of touch. If, however, I'm talking to an audience and I'm in a certain country and I'm talking about another country that I visited and I've experienced something where I thought there was a breach of human rights, but there was something humorous in the story, then this might be the right place to use the humour. Now, as I say, this lightness of touch, this enjoying the presentation, it can be very difficult to achieve, and it can be difficult really to get the balance, and it can be very difficult to define. And I think one of the things I would like to do here then is give you a real life example. Now, there's a really famous speech that was given by Steve Jobs. It was a commencement address to students at Stanford University. And this is, for me, this is a great speech. You can analyze and analyze and analyze a speech, and you can find different things in it. But one of the things you really notice about the speech is the lightness of touch that Steve Jobs uses. Now, if I put the presentation into context, Steve Jobs at the time was a successful business person. He was older than the students that he was presenting to, and he wanted to say something to the students that would inspire them and give them advice as they moved on from university into their lives. Now, Steve Jobs was very successful. There was a certain stance that he could have taken in this presentation. He could have talked about himself. He could have talked about himself as the great Steve Jobs and given really good examples of great work that he had achieved. But what he chose to do in the speech was actually give 3 stories from his life and 3 examples from his life that showed his vulnerability as a human being, that maybe showed a weakness or even failure. And the last story that he deals with is the subject of death. Now, death in many ways is a little bit of a taboo subject. It's a difficult subject to deal with. Now, here maybe I can illustrate the difference between telling a joke and using a sense of humour. Now, a typical kind of British joke about death would be one like this. And this is the story of a Yorkshire man who's lying, and he's been ill for some time, and he's lying in his bedroom and he's approaching death. And he calls his wife to his deathbed, and his wife says, "Oh, please, please don't leave us." He calls his sons to his deathbed, and they say, "Oh, Father, you've been wonderful to us." And then he calls his daughter to his deathbed, and she says, "Oh, Dad, oh, Dad." And then he calls his grandchildren to the deathbed, and then he says to his grandchildren, "Why don't you turn the lights off downstairs?" Now, this isn't really, I haven't told it in the best way. I'm not the best comedian in the world. I don't find, it's quite difficult for me to relate because I don't find it particularly funny, and you probably don't find it funny either. You probably don't even understand it. This is very culturally bound, and the story is about somebody who lives in Yorkshire, and somebody in Yorkshire, in British culture, they can have the reputation of being mean. This is, for me, it's breaking into stereotypes, and it's something that I just wouldn't use at all. But when Steve Jobs talks about death, he talks about his own experience, and he talks about getting his diagnosis for cancer, and he talks about facing the possibility of death. And he says something like, and I'll give the link for both the speech and the text for the speech in the description below. He says something like, "But nobody wants to die. Even people who go to heaven don't want to die to get there." And the audience, the group of young people that he's presenting to, they laugh at this point, and Steve Jobs stops and he allows them to laugh at this point. Now, this is a sense of humour, and it works really well. It works really well in this speech, and it fits completely in the speech that Steve Jobs is giving. So now let's move on to my second superpower, which is the power of silence. Now, I guess you've maybe been to a presentation and the presenter has just talked and talked and talked. And maybe the presenter was a little bit nervous and they just got faster and faster and faster. And as a listener, as an audience member, you began to feel that the presentation, you began to feel that it was a little bit exhausting, and you found it really difficult to catch up with the thinking and the thoughts of the presenter. Now, this is really easy to do as a presenter. We tend to think as presenters that all the time that we should be talking and talking and talking, and that we should fill in silences. And actually, when you're presenting, the opposite is true. Sometimes silence can be really, really effective. And this sounds like it shouldn't be true. But actually, silence is something, it draws the audience in, and it gives them time, in a sense, to breathe and to catch up with your thinking. Now, it can be a really difficult thing to do. If you're a little bit unsure about providing silences in your presentations, I would just experiment a little bit with them. For example, when you ask a rhetorical question, this is a very natural time to have a pause. You ask the rhetorical question, and then you give the listeners a little bit of time to think about their answer and to process their thinking. So, for example, what do you think about this? And you give the audience a little bit of time to think about it. Another very natural place to provide pauses and silence in your presentation is also at the end of every point. So you get to the end of the first point of your presentation, and then you want to move on to the second one, for example. Now, if you find pausing very difficult and you find that you just feel that you're filling in silences and filling in silences, one of the techniques that you can use is just to count a few seconds in your head. Let's say 6 seconds. So that brings me to the end of the first point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's move on to the second point. Of course, you don't count the numbers, you just count them in your head. So that brings me to the end of the first point. Let's move on to the second point. Now, because we want to fill in silences, we then get to the issue of verbal garbage. And a lot of us have verbal garbage. And verbal garbage are simply these little expressions that we put into speech all the time to fill in gaps. These would be, for example, like, you know, okay. It can even be sounds like or ah. Now, for example, I was only listening to an interview last night on television, and it was with a famous British rapper. And I thought what he was saying was really interesting, but all the time he kept using the word like. And in the end, I began to find it really difficult to listen to what he was saying. Now, sometimes when you're listening to a presentation, this is the effect. When somebody says, you know, all the time, then all you begin to listen to, or all you begin to hear after a while is, you know. So what do you do if you've got verbal garbage? Well, the first thing is to know that you have it. And the only way to know that you have it sometimes is for somebody to tell you that you have it. And this will be in feedback. And again, if you're in a university or in an organization and you're getting the chance for lots of training and lots of practice, then ask people to comment on the fact whether you have verbal garbage or not. Maybe they will tell you anyway that you know. When you present, I keep hearing, you know. If you're unsure, another thing you can do is just record yourself, put yourself on your mobile phone and watch yourself back, and you might begin to realize for the first time that you have verbal garbage. Now, the first thing to do is to be aware that you have verbal garbage. Once you're aware of it, then you can begin to take steps to eliminate the verbal garbage. And you have to, every time you feel yourself saying you just stop yourself and try and stop yourself saying it. Again, it's a matter of practice, and the more you do this, the more that you will eliminate these little bits of like, okay. So let's move on to the third and the final superpower, and this is the power of you. And this is the word or the concept of you. And the you in a presentation is your audience, it's the listeners. Now, we know from everyday life that you, when people address the you, that can be much more powerful, and it can talk to us much more than when people use I. A couple of weeks ago, I went out to lunch with a couple of relatives of mine and my sister, and we had a really nice lunch. But when we got in the car to come home, my sister said to me, I really like, but whenever she talks to us, she always talks about herself and she tells us about her life, but she never asks any questions about me. And we all know people like this. They talk and talk and talk about themselves, but they never ask you any questions about you. And if you think about you, then what you will begin to do, if you try and address the you will engage people again, and you will also begin to think about the benefits and the needs and the wants and desires and maybe even the dreams of the people that you're speaking to. And once you address that you, then people will click in much more to what you're saying. Now, a very typical example of this would be maybe at the beginning of a presentation. And it's really easy at the beginning of a presentation to talk about yourself. In some ways you have to. You have to talk about yourself, you have to talk about your job, your background. You say things like, this is my presentation and in my subject, and I've divided my presentation into 3 parts. Now what you can do here then is use this technique which is called WIFI, or what's in it for you. It's sometimes called what's in it for me. And basically this is addressing the you. So you think about the benefits and you think about why the audience members need to listen to your presentation, and you tell them that, you express it right at the beginning of the presentation. You say something like, the reason you need to listen to this presentation is. You will always be more powerful than I. You, instead of I all the time. You is sometimes regarded as one of the most powerful words in the English language. And again, to give you an example, I would like to come back to that speech of Steve Jobs. And again, if you go to the text or you go and listen to this speech, what you will discover is, as I said before, there are 3 stories. And each story is about Steve Jobs. And at the beginning of the story, he talks about himself. And he talks about what he experienced, and he talks about what he learned from the experience. But at the end of every story, he comes back to the you, and he addresses the people that he's talking to, which are these young people who are moving out into life. And he tells them what this story means for you. And he addresses you directly. And it's a very skillful use of you, and it's really effective. And at the end of the presentation, he says something like, he talks about the message that he's giving from the presentation, and he said, I've always wished this for myself, and now I wish this for you. You, as I said before, will always be more effective than I. So that was this video. Very simple, 3 superpowers. The power of mindset, the power of silence, and the power of you. Just incorporate these in your presentations and you will begin to find that your presentations become more powerful. I'd like to thank you for listening. Please like, subscribe, hit the notification, and have a look at my other videos on presentations. Bye.